There are so many girls that are, whether they get on stage or not, right, they're dieting to quite kind of extremes, and that's not always sustainable and healthy. So yeah, just tell us a little bit about your journey with that. Like, what made you interested in bikini comps in the first place, and how have we ended up here where you now work with clients to kind of restore that life post-show?
Yeah, so I got into sport from a very young age. I started playing football when I was 12. And I was the kind of person through my teens who threw myself into everything. I was part of like every sport team. I did running, football, gymnastics, trampolining. And then as you get into your late teens, obviously you lose touch with a lot of those sports teams and you sort of fall out of it a little bit. And I started training. Well, I started training. When I initially started training when I was about 14, 15 years old, I went to a local gym with my mom and I did what everyone does and just did, 5 or 10 minutes on a cardio machine and then did the basic resistance machines that I knew how to use and navigate. I wasn't following any sort of structured program or anything like that. And then I fell into doing, have you heard of Kayla at Signs?
Yeah, that sounds familiar on Instagram.
She had guides called the BBG. Really? So I started doing those at like 10 p.m. at night in my bedroom most days, and also started going to the gym alongside that. And as my sports sort of died down a little bit, I invested more time into training, and that sort of replaced that. And then I joined a gym on my own when I became the age where you're actually allowed to join a gym, because that was when I was going with my mom. And I started going to all the classes. I started resistance training. I started following some workouts on bodybuilding.com, and I was in the gym all the time. So by the time I'd done my sort of A-levels, the gym manager had said to me, if you ever want a job here, you've got one, by the way. So I was originally going to go to uni and do sport and exercise science. I had an offer, but I was like, hang on a minute, is this really the right thing for me? And I could just go into personal training straight away. So I decided to do my PT course, and after must have been about 6 months of working as a PT, obviously whilst I was resistance training, I'd started to develop muscle tissue, and one of the other PTs said to me, look, have you ever thought about competing? And at the time I had heard of bodybuilding. I'd followed quite a few like YouTubers like Nikki Blackter, some of the like OGs, and it appealed to me. So I always had a competitive streak to me, so I was like, why not? This is the next challenge. It's an opportunity to push myself, see what I'm capable of, and it's probably an opportunity to put myself through a similar process to what my clients would go through as well. So I decided to start bodybuilding, pretty much started my first prep straight away, with no real structure before that, which was probably a bad move, but anyway. And then did my first season in 2016. My first show, I would say that I wasn't in true condition, and I loved it, but the prep wasn't anywhere near as like extreme as what my preps were towards the end. And bodybuilding at the time was very much a part of my life rather than something that consumed me. And I had a very knowledgeable coach who I learned so much from. So the whole process was enjoyable and it wasn't so extreme. But then I competed again in 2017, 2018, and took 2019 as an improvement season. And my last season was 2020. And the further into bodybuilding I got, the more extreme it got. And the more sacrifices I made from a health perspective, and also the more I realised how detrimental it was. Because in my first sort of season, I didn't quite realise how much, like losing my menstrual cycle, for example, would have an impact on my health. I was quite naive to that. And I suppose at the time I was kind of like, well, if I don't have a period, it's not the end of the world. It's quite convenient, really. And I think at the time, a lot of people were wearing that sort of thing as a bit of a badge of honour, whereas now people are much more aware of the negative effects that come with that. So yeah, the further into my bodybuilding journey I got, the more extreme it got. And it very much started to consume my entire life. Like towards the end, it was all I thought about. All of my friends, my boyfriend at the time, were bodybuilders. And I'd very much just become the stereotypical bodybuilder who was like tracing their pro card. It was my entire life. And I was like, wait, I've lost a lot of myself here. And like, what am I actually doing this for anymore? So that's where I really started to question that and then came away from it. But yeah, it took me a long time to do that. And I think sometimes you don't realise what you're doing until you take a step back, and the impacts of what you're doing until you take a step back. And my initial reason for getting into personal training was I always loved helping people, and I wanted to help women progress towards their goals whilst actually improving their health and quality of life. But the further I got into bodybuilding, I then started to coach bodybuilders as well, because it became my entire life. But I always had this sort of like inner internal conflict when I was coaching bodybuilders, because I cared so much about my clients, but I was pushing them through this process that I knew would have a negative impact on their health. So I kind of, once I realised that bodybuilding was no longer right for me, I then took a step back from coaching competitors as well, because I realised that wasn't right for me. And I feel like I came back to my original values, my original reason for getting into the industry, as opposed to like getting lost and just going with the flow and doing what everyone else is doing.